Is there anyone here who hasn't heard Todd before? Emily, were you here for another time? Okay, Emily, this is Todd DiCastino. You will never miss another one. And he graduated with an undergraduate degree from some Ivy League place, and then he got another big group degree from another Ivy League place. Then he taught at Penn State Beaver, but he didn't like grading blue books, and the kids didn't give it, they didn't care to study. And so he started these lectures for the people who really care about learning, and the Veterans Breakfast Club. So, Todd.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you very much. We are talking about World War I, and we have been talking about World War I. And last time I was here, somebody gave me what you would call a backhanded compliment. I will not name him. I won't embarrass him like that. But what he said was, what he said was, you know, your lectures are more interesting than your lecture titles. Yeah, and you have a point. Yeah, my lecture titles aren't, I mean, World War I Part 3 doesn't really sell it. You know what I mean? We devoted World War I Part 1 and Part 2 to just the first 5 months of the war. That's how complicated and important and mysterious in many ways the beginning of World War I was. Tonight, I'm going to zip through 3 years in one night. Yes, which isn't as difficult as it sounds, because at the end of 1914, this was the Western Front, stretching from the English Channel or the North Sea, this red line, all the way down to the northern border of Switzerland, about 400 miles. At the end of 1914, that's when the front was established. This was the front at the end of 1917. It didn't move. 3 years. That's the fundamental fact of World War I. The two sides were evenly matched, but much more important than that, the 20th century technological developments all favored defense. All favored defensive positions, machine guns, high explosive artillery, poured concrete, barbed wire, mines, all that stuff favored defense, which meant that offensive operations were never going to work. No matter how good they were, no matter how well thought out they were never going to work. And defensive positions rarely were going to fail. So that meant the two sides were dug into strong defensive positions, and they would be for the entire war. This was the problem of World War I, and it was a problem without a solution. The problem would not be solved until 1939-1940 with Blitzkrieg War. It just so happens that this was the state of affairs for technological development of weaponry in 1914 and the early 20th century. So because of that, because of the stalemate on the Western Front, there was a desperate search to find a way out. Where else in the world can we fight and win? Both sides put a whole lot of hope on the Eastern Front, which was not 400 miles, but 1,200 miles long. So big that it was impossible to blanket it with defensive positions. So the Eastern Front was much more fluid than the West. You'll remember Russia mobilized 3 weeks earlier than the Germans anticipated. After 3 weeks after mobilization began July 28, 1914. 3 weeks later, August 17, 1914, the Russian army has already penetrated eastern Prussia and the eastern border of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Russia had great advantages. Number one, they were twice the size of the German army. Twice the size. So they were able to mobilize much faster and with a huge force. Unfortunately, only about half those soldiers were armed. They were really poorly equipped. They were really poorly led. and the Germans were able to counterattack under the leadership at the Battle of Tannenberg. This is where the famous Battle of Tannenberg was fought, under the leadership of Paul von Hindenburg. Here he is pictured at the Battle of Tannenberg. And I believe that looks a lot like Ludendorff, Erich von Ludendorff. These two would go on to become, they would not only become the commanders-in-chief of the entire German war effort, they would essentially become the autocratic dictators of Germany by 1916, 1917. They're running the country, they're running the war. And Germany was able to push the Russians all the way back, deep into Russia. And I mean, the casualties are just unbelievable that the Russians suffer. At the Battle of Tannenberg, one German army defeated two Russian armies, the Russian First and Second Army. I think the Russian Second Army, which was about 150,000 soldiers, I think 10,000 of those soldiers made it back to Russia. All the others killed or captured. I mean, the casualty rate on the Eastern Front is just unbelievable. All Russia does is lose and lose and lose. And yet, like a big, huge, heavyweight boxer that just gets pummeled in the ring, can't even counterpunch, but won't go down. You know, Russia stayed in the war. It would take Russia 2.5 years finally to begin to collapse. And then 3.5 years to get out of the war altogether and really collapse. So Russia was, although they were beaten and desperate, they survived. They survived barely and at a huge human cost. We don't know how many killed. Russian soldiers were killed in World War I. This is a guess. 2.2 million? To give you a sense, 10 times, 15 times that number would be killed in World War II. But this is an enormous number for Russia. 2.2 million wounded, 2.5 million POW, 3.5, about 9, 10, 11, 12 million Russian soldiers over the course of World War I are killed, wounded, or captured. So there's a huge, the Germans are frustrated that they cannot defeat the Russian Empire in the East, in this huge sprawling front. And the Allies are kind of buoyed by the hope that maybe if they could equip, maybe if they could send advisors and officers to help the Russians, they might be able to defeat the German army in the East. And so there's a plan. The problem is that Russia is completely isolated. They're not getting equipped, or they're not being able to be supplied at all by their allies, France and Great Britain. But there is this plan that somebody comes up with, and you know his name. Winston Churchill, of whom somebody said, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty during World War I, a man with many ideas, none of them good. His idea was, it wasn't that crackpot an idea, it was to supply Russia through the Black Sea. You'll notice this is Crimea, this is Ukraine, here's Russia right here. If we could get supplies into the Black Sea, we could equip and supply Russia and help them in their war in the East. So the idea was to sail a fleet into the Mediterranean, through the Aegean, and then through these two narrow Turkish straits. And here's where the problem was. This was the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was on the German side, the side of the Central Powers. And so it meant sneaking through these two very narrow straits. This one called the Dardanelles, this one called the Bosphorus, through the Sea of Marmara, and then into the Black Sea. The idea was that, the theory that the British had was that the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. It was once a powerful empire, but it was 700 years old. It was ready to fall, and it could not possibly defend these straits very well. So here is, again, the Dardanelles right here, and the Bosphorus right here. And the Bosphorus Strait is the strait that splits the city of Istanbul today, Constantinople, in half. So half the cities in Asia, half the cities in Europe, right here. So the idea was to send a fleet through in these lines represent minefields, and these squares represent batteries, gun batteries, to kind of force the Navy through. 1 month, there was an effort to force a pretty big fleet through the Dardanelles. It didn't work. They hit mines, they got torpedoed, they got shot with guns. I think 6 large British and French ships were sunk in February, March 1915. Just could not get through. And so the idea was then that this piece of land called Gallipoli had to be occupied to take out these gun emplacements and secure the lane so the ships can go through. So the idea was to land 78,000 troops on April 25th, 1915, here at Hellas Point, and here, what would become known as Anzac Cove. They succeeded in landing the troops, but those troops did not move from the beaches, or not far in from the beaches, for the next 8 months, 9 months. It was horrific. The Battle of Gallipoli, these guys were stuck on that shingle. They were stuck at the edge of the peninsulas right here. And it just evolved into, just like the Western Front, a line of trenches, except in 100-degree heat and 50 yards away from each other rather than 500 yards away from each other. So with a lot of sickness, the casualty rate, again, off the charts. Out of 870,000 soldiers that fought in the battle, 550,000 killed and wounded. That's 65% of all soldiers who fought in the Battle of Gallipoli were killed or wounded. 60 or 65%. Finally, Great Britain pulled the plug on the Battle of Gallipoli, evacuated all the troops in January 1916. It wasn't going to work. I'm not going to talk about it now, but there's another really interesting and important reason Great Britain decided to go to war with the Ottoman Empire. It's worth talking about, and I hope I will be able to talk about it maybe in a month or two, because it still very much has relevance today. Great Britain wasn't just trying to supply the Russian Empire, they were also trying to defeat the Ottoman Empire for a very specific reason, and I'll talk about that sometime. So, the Eastern Front isn't working. The Ottoman Front isn't working. Let's create a new front in Italy. The problem is Italy is neutral. They haven't decided which side they're going to be on yet. Both sides woo Italy and make them offers. If you join us, you get this. Britain made the better offer. Essentially, if you join us, you're going to get a good big piece of Italian-speaking Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so, although it wasn't popular, the government of Italy decided to go to war on the side of the Allies, and they opened up a front right up here in the Alps, in the Italian Alps, against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was called the White War. It was fought it devolved into a trench war stalemate for years, just like on the Western Front, except at 6,500 feet. It turns out that the casualty rate, I could be wrong, but I think the casualty rate in the White War, in the Winter War, the White War up here in the Alps, I think it's the highest casualty rate of all the fronts of World War I. And I think it's because of the ice and the rock. On the Western Front in Flanders, an artillery shell will fall and explode and throw mud on people. So much mud that you could suffocate in it. But in the Alps, an artillery shell would explode and explode rock and ice. And people were killed by flying ice. They were killed by avalanches. They were killed by flying rock. Does anybody recognize this guy? Benito Mussolini, World War I. Look at these Italian soldiers, Alpini, they were called. Remember my theory about the better you look in war, the worse soldiers you have? These guys, with the exception of the Marine Corps, of course, these guys look so good. How about these men, this is a picture of Austro-Hungarian troops getting to the front line. They have to climb to get to the front line. Can you imagine like what it took to get the artillery guns in place? You know, they had to be hauled there. Tramways had to be created. There had to be like a cable car system. Here's a wounded being evacuated. It was just unbelievable. And again, it was a stalemated war. Finally, Germany entered to assist their allies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and right toward the end of the war, managed to push the Italians down almost to the Venetian plain, to Venice. And then the Italians managed a minor counteroffensive, and that's where the war ended, kind of inconclusively in northern Italy. But because of receding glaciers in the Alps, there are bodies still from the First World War being uncovered, still being discovered. These are photos from a National Geographic article from maybe 10 years ago. 2 Austrian soldiers were discovered in the ice. They were uncovered, incredibly well preserved, so much so that they were able to get the identities of these soldiers. They were both, I think one was 17 years old, one was 18 years old. And the 17-year-old had a letter in his pocket to his girlfriend that he never got to mail. And in the letter was a poem that he wrote. He said to his girlfriend something like, boy, the world lost a pretty funny person when he died in World War I. He said something like, you know, dear girlfriend Maria, you know that I love you, but there's somebody, I have to admit, somebody closer to me than you could ever be. He's always with me, always next to me, never leaves my side, body lice. So there was a ceremony burying the remains of these soldiers with Italian and Austrian officials. So with the failure of the Eastern Front as a stalemate, you know, the Ottoman Front's a stalemate, the Italian Front is a stalemate, Germany made the decision, and they made it first, and it would continue throughout the war this way. Germany made a decision that they were going to dig permanent defensive positions. Here's what trenches look like in Christmas, for the Christmas truce of 1914. Pretty shallow, you know, pretty rudimentary. These are temporary kind of, you know, places to find shelter, defensive positions. This is what they looked like a year later. The Germans, first of all, Germans, as we know, are wonderful engineers, and they put all their engineering prowess into those defensive lines. But the British and the French, they also had their engineers, but they never saw the trenches as a permanent place to stay. You know, France was occupied. France was occupied. They were more desperate to be on the offensive than the Germans were. The Germans were fairly happy where they were, so they dug in. It was much, much better to live life in a German trench than a British trench. Much better. They were much safer, much deeper, much more complex. Look at that, 2 handrails. Even, look how wide these steps are. You know, they are way better. They have all kinds of conference rooms in them, good, you know, hospital facilities, medical facilities. A lot of them are reinforced with poured concrete, with the British and the French tended not to be. Many of the German trenches you can still see today. And again, the reason why the Germans dug in and felt that they could wait out the war right there was because they, as they saw it, they were winning. At the end of 1915, they're winning. This is what the map looks like in 1915. This gray mass is Germany. Here is the original borders of Germany. You can see this black line is the eastern border. This black line is the southern border, and this black line is the western border of Germany. You can see that the gray spills out. Germany has taken over all of Belgium and a large part of France with about 2 million people living in it. It's a harsh occupation. These French citizens here are now living under German occupation. Poland is also under German occupation. They're pretty deep within the Russian Empire. Germany is winning. If the war were to stop December 31st, 1915, Germany wins. They do not feel the need to move. What they need to do is survive. If they can wait this out, if they can inflict damage on the enemy to the point where the enemy has to surrender, then they win. France and Britain never felt that luxury. France especially. This was a war for survival for France. And just picture this. You are the head of a country, France, that has a population of 40 million people. 2 million of your citizens are under enemy occupation. What is your job? To liberate them, right? You'll do anything to free those people. So France spends 1915 and some of 1916 and the rest of the war with offensive operations, offensive after offensive operations. They're the ones who are coming out of the trenches, charging across no man's land, and attacking the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd German trenches. They're the ones on the offensive. It's the French in 1915 who are out of the trenches doing the fighting, which means they're the ones who are going to die. Because offensive operations are impossible in World War I. These are just some of the larger offensives that the French army, which is gigantic, by the way. The French army is, you'll remember, the French army at the beginning of the war was like 3 million men. The British army was 120,000. The French army is in charge of this war. The British are little brothers, very little brothers that help out. You know, this is, World War I at the beginning is a French operation. It's France versus Germany on the Western Front, with Great Britain helping out as it can. So France needs to push Germany out, and it can't do it. It tries offensive after offensive. Here are a few. The Battle of Champagne, 50,000 French casualties. The Battle of Saint-Mihiel, 60,000 French casualties. The Second Battle of Artois, 102,000 French casualties. The Third Battle of Artois, 48,000 casualties. These are all in 1915. Pretty soon you start running out of people. The Second Battle of Champagne, 245,000 casualties. Total French casualties by December 31st, 1915, that's about that's 17 months of war. 750,000 killed from a population of 40 million. 2 million wounded in action. The Germans they see it pretty soon. France is not going to have enough men to fill the ranks. France is going to collapse. What we need to do, German says, is survive long enough to see the French collapse and to give the French a push. You know? Find out a way to make them collapse more quickly. And the Germans do it. They come up with a scheme around Christmas time, 1915. And the scheme is to attack the French line right where the French will experience it at its most vulnerable, and that is at the town of Verdun. It just so happened that the Western Front passed just east of the city of Verdun. Verdun is the oldest city in France, founded by the Romans in 50 BC. The French people were born in Verdun. The Gallic, culture, civilization was created in Verdun. I think, I could be wrong, Charlemagne was crowned in Aachen, Germany, but I think he was crowned twice, and I think once was in Verdun. But I make a lot of stuff up. Verdun, yeah, you don't know. Exactly, what are you going to do, look it up? Verdun. Verdun has almost a sacred quality in French culture. It's a town with maybe 25 large forts and 40 small forts that have been built since before the Middle Ages. It's something that the Germans knew. It's a place, it's like the Alamo to Texans, Kosovo to Serbians, like a holy ground. And the Germans knew that the French would do anything to prevent Verdun from falling, and the Germans saw a vulnerability. They knew that if they got, this is the front line at the beginning of the Battle of Verdun, up here, this black line up here. They knew that if they were able to take some ground, which is actually a very ambitious thing to do in World War I, that they could get some high ground right here on the Meuse River, and they could get their big guns into place, and they could fire a lot of artillery into these really sensitive cultural areas of France. They could kill a lot of French people, but most importantly, they could damage the morale of the French nation. And what the French nation will do is rally to save Verdun, to the last man. The idea was that Germans could figure out a way to bring the French army, the French infantry, to Verdun, and then the Germans would just mow them down at little loss to Germany. That was the idea, and that was the idea communicated by this man, Erich von Falkenhayn, who was the head of the Western Front at that time, to the Kaiser on Christmas Day, 1915. He wrote, "The string in France has reached its breaking point. A mass breakthrough is beyond our means and is unnecessary. The French General Staff will feel compelled to defend Verdun with every man they have. If they do so, the forces of France will bleed to death. We will bleed them white." That was it. He's announcing, what Falkenhayn is announcing here is a battle of, or a war of attrition. We're stalemated. There's no amount of strategy, no amount of maneuvering that is going to win this war. We simply have to break the will of the enemy so the enemy collapses. And so they bring these big guns into position and they start firing. I think the first day of the Battle of Verdun, this is Big Bertha. I think this is Big Bertha. This was one of the largest artillery guns that the Germans had, a railway gun. They begin, I think first day of the Battle of Verdun, I think it's February 21st, 1916. That first day, Germany fires 1 million artillery shells in 10 hours. 1 million artillery shells fired from, I think, 880 guns in 10 hours, continually. And the devastation, you can see, this is what they do. This is one of the targets, one of the early targets. Here it is before the shelling, here it is after. The kind of, imprint that this left on the landscape is just indelible. It worked. It absolutely worked. It was a bloodbath. Verdun was a bloodbath. France poured everything they could to save it. Unfortunately, it did cost the Germans more blood also than they anticipated. But make no mistake, the idea was to bleed France white. And this is kind of Exhibit A. Here is a commemorative coin, if you could believe it, celebrated in Germany during the battle. It's a skeleton pumping what looks like a water pump, but I think it says Verdun, the world's blood pump. Verdun ends up being the longest battle of World War I. It lasts from February to December 1916. Not the bloodiest, but close to the bloodiest. But typically of these World War I battles, almost no ground changes hands. A hill there, a dale there. But by the end of the battle, they're at their original start points, but at huge loss, including 163 killed in action in the Battle of Verdun alone. Just stunning. Germany, almost the same number. This was just took a horrific toll. And it succeeded, the Verdun, as a strategy on the Germans' part, succeeded in knocking France out of leadership. You know, I had said that World War I for the Allies was France in charge and Great Britain little brother. France was no longer the big brother at the end of Verdun. They couldn't do it. You know, the French approached the British and said, we're done for about a year. We can't launch a major offensive until we have another group of kids who were born in 1898 come of age so they're old enough to join the army, and we could put them in uniform and bring them into battle. So that left leadership of the war to the British. By early 1916, leadership has passed to the British. And this is the commander of the British forces, Sir Douglas Haig. Probably the most hated general in history, I would think. I mean, he's gotten more bad press than any general I could ever think of. He's not liked for a lot of reasons. Number one, he wasted a lot of lives. That's usually the accusation with Douglas Haig. He was Scottish. He was humorless. He was a very chauvinistic Scot. But I think what really damns Haig the most is he was unimaginative. He couldn't see, or he refused to see, that this was a different kind of war, that offensive operations were impossible. He thought offensive operations were possible. And he wrote it in many memos, and he would write them like this: what we need are more shells. What we need are more horses. What we need are more men. And with more firepower, more horsepower, and more manpower, we will be able to get over the top and defeat the enemy. He didn't give up on this idea that these defensive positions could be overcome. And that's kind of what doomed him. Halfway through the battle, he gets the word from France that, hey buddy, we need you to, you gotta do something to take the heat off of us in Verdun. So Haig agrees to open up a second battle site on the line, about 125 miles northwest of Verdun. Here's Verdun. Here's the Somme. It's on the River Somme. He thinks that the Germans have a vulnerable position here, and it's a good location to launch the largest offensive of World War I. This, the Battle of the Somme, would be the largest battle of World War I. It would eclipse even Verdun. And again, it all involved a lot of preparation. It took at least 6 months to get production in Britain up so that the shells could arrive at the Somme, because his idea was to take whatever the Germans did on the first day of the Battle of Verdun and almost double it in terms of artillery fire. I think they ended up firing about 2 million shells in the first 7 days of the Battle of the Somme. 2 million shells. And the idea was to take out, we talked about the trench system last time. The first trench was the fighting trench, the second trench was the support trench, the third trench was the reserve trench. His idea was to take out that first 2 trenches with artillery fire. And so it was continual, round-the-clock firing of shells, 1 every 3 seconds for 7 days, 24 hours a day, 7 days. And just against these first 2 trenches. And a lot of them were big shells like this. The problem is a lot of those shells didn't explode. And there's still debate. You could find historians debating why those shells didn't explode. The British historians will say, well, half those shells were purchased from the United States. And which was true. But I think the real reason was shells had never been mass produced like this before. I mean, they're rushing these shells into production. So it is true, about 35, maybe 50% of the shells did not explode. So the damage to the German trenches wasn't as bad as was predicted. It also, in preparation for this war, or for this battle, was a several month, and I mean a 5 or 6 month effort to dig a tunnel underneath no man's land and then underneath the German trenches. Pack the tunnel with explosives and then blow it up right before the infantry attack. This involved bringing in 25,000 Scottish coal miners that were called sappers, who built these tunnels, just like this, underneath no man's land to pack them with explosives under the Germans. Now the whole time the Germans are doing the same thing. So a really important piece of equipment, if you ever watch a documentary about it, it's totally fascinating, is the stethoscope. Because these miners would listen to the walls to try and identify where the enemy is digging so they can attack the enemy. And the enemy is doing the same thing. It's just fascinating. The Scottish coal miners do dig the tunnel. They do pack it with 24 tons of explosives. And then 2 minutes before the order is given to the British infantry to rise up out of the trench and charge across no man's land, the 24 tons of explosives are detonated. It's the largest man-made explosion in history up to that time. It's considered probably the loudest man-made noise in history. People in London heard it very clearly. It's called the Lochnagar explosion, or the Lochnagar mine, named after the Scottish town, I think, where the miners were from that dug it. It was exploded at 7:28 a.m. on July 1st, 1916. This is a picture of it. And this is the crater that it left. You can still see it today. These are people standing around the crater.
Whoa.
And the British soldiers had to run down into the crater and then up the other side to get to the Germans. Here are some British soldiers leaving the trench to go across no man's land. The explosion happens at 7:28. 2 minutes later at 7:30, you have the non-commissioned officers who are blowing the whistles, meaning get out of the trench, start charging. 110,000 British troops rise up and charge no man's land against the Germans. 110,000. By noon, 60,000 of them are shot. 20,000 dead. By noon. It's the largest loss of life in British history in war in one day. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's unspeakable. This is why there's so much calumny against Douglas Haig for sending men wave after wave on that morning, even as he saw that they were being mowed down. The battle would go on, end in December, and the casualties were greater than even Verdun. About 1.2 million killed and wounded, both sides altogether, in 5 or 6 months of battle. You can see 620 casualties for the French and the British, 440,000 casualties for the Germans, with hardly any land being taken on either side. By the end of the battle, the trench lines are the same, no progress is made. Verdun and the Somme just emblemize the futility of offensive operations and the futility of the war on the Western Front in World War I. Something happened to the British psyche, and this is another thing that I hope that I will get to, how World War I changed Europe's understanding of themselves and of the world. And I think Edmund Blunden, who was there at the Somme on the first day and survived it, he puts it in his memoir. He says, by the end of the day, both sides had seen, in a sad scrawl of broken earth and murdered men, the answer to the question. Neither side had won, nor could win the war. The war had won, and would go on winning. This sense that the war had taken on a life of its own, and it was never going to end. You could imagine, look at this absolutely bone-chilling cartoon in the masses of death, dancing in a pool of blood, with France, Great Britain, and Russia. And death is saying, come on in, America, the blood is fine. Oh, absolutely chilling. You can imagine what it was like to be an American in 1916 and to watch the newsreels and to read the paper about what was happening on the Western Front. It was horrific. Can you imagine how relieved Americans were knowing that they were 5,000 miles away? That we had this great ocean keeping us from this catastrophe, and this president, Woodrow Wilson, keeping us out of it. That was, of course, the American tradition from the time of President Washington's farewell address, in which he said, you know, we as a country should never get involved in European affairs. And Thomas Jefferson, who didn't agree with George Washington on much, agreed with him on that. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. That's what Jefferson said. Woodrow Wilson, right down the line. That was the American foreign policy from the very beginning. We will focus on expanding our continental empire. We will focus on any sectional conflicts that we have here, but we will not get involved at all in crazy Europe with its ancient rivalries, its impossible to understand diplomacy, its secret alliances. No, the U.S. has the luxury of being removed from the great power conflict of Europe. And Woodrow Wilson, when he ran for re-election in 1916, he ran on an anti-war platform. Here's a button, a campaign button: war in Europe, peace in America, God bless Wilson. And I like this cartoon very much. Here's Uncle Sam standing next to President Wilson while the god of war, the angry god of war, is calling to him from across the Atlantic Ocean, beckoning him to join them. Yes?
What was the posture of Russia at this particular time, Todd?
The Russian Empire was an ally of Great Britain and France. It was the three great powers of Europe, Britain, France, and the Russian Empire, versus the two other great powers of Europe, Austro-Hungary and Germany. So they were involved in the Eastern Front.
They were still under the Tsar's control.
They were still under the Tsar's control. That's a great question, yes. I'm going to get to that. Yeah, the Tsar himself had taken over leadership of the war, and boy, was he terrible. So, President Wilson kept us out of war, but there was a problem, and it was a big problem, and it was one that even historians don't write about very much, but I think they should. And I may be exaggerating it, but I don't think I am. I think this is how I understand the situation. 1914, the United States enters what should have become the Great Depression. It's a really bad recession, really bad. And there were dire predictions that this is going to spiral into what the Great Depression in the 1930s eventually did spiral into, which is a deflationary crisis. And, with mass unemployment beyond anything that the world had ever seen before. 1914, it happens. By the fall of 1914, there's a miracle. It's called the war. Right? Europe is consumed with war. And so now almost everything that they need, food, medicine, fertilizer, equipment, weapons, of course, has to come from the United States. It saves the U.S. and the world from the Great Depression. The U.S. is in a perfect position to take advantage of the war. We're a neutral power, we're not on either side, and we have always believed in freedom of the seas. We've signed international agreements guaranteeing the freedom of the seas, which means if you're a neutral power during a time of war, you could trade with anyone. All sides, both sides, you could sell any side, anything. And the U.S. proceeded to do just that, loading up cargo ships, loading up merchant ships, sending them across the ocean, selling a lot of stuff to Great Britain and France. And you can see how there's a jump. Here's green, this is trade, this is exports to Great Britain, the green bar, 1914. And you can see how it almost doubles in 1915. We're selling almost twice as much to Great Britain as we did the year before because of the war. Same with the blue bar, which is France. But look at the red bar, which is Germany. It goes from being about $300 million in trade to nothing in 1915. Why not? Is the US refusing to sell to Germany? No. We're loading, Germany's placing orders. We're loading up ships, we're sending it to Germany, but some dastardly country is intercepting our ships, boarding them, stealing cargo, and turning the ships around and sending them back, not allowing the US to supply Germany with anything. This is against international agreement, it's against the principle of freedom of seas, and that country was Great Britain. Great Britain was intercepting American cargo ships and not allowing the US to deliver anything to Germany. It was part of the larger British strategy against Germany in World War I. And just as an aside, and I'm looking at the clock, I think it's important that I say this. It worked. Great Britain, very early on, came up with a deeply inhumane approach to the war against Germany. We're going to starve them. We're going to starve them. We're going to blockade the country so they can't get any food, they can't get any fertilizer, they can't get any medicine, they can't get any farm equipment, and when Germany is in famine, they will surrender. It worked. It worked. I think if you were to point to one reason why Germany collapsed finally in 1918, it was because of starvation on the home front. That was it. The country was collapsing. I think it did work. But for the US, it's been a big problem, you know. So we're kind of being forced to be the arsenal of the Allies, the arsenal of France and Great Britain, banned from trading with Germany. And the US protests it. There are plenty of Americans who think we should go to war with Great Britain over this. They happen to be Irish and German Americans. But there's serious talk, like we should go to war with Great Britain over this. And so the US placed protests. We fight the British on it. There are speeches in Congress about it. And then behind the scenes, there's an agreement made with Great Britain. Great Britain says this: you load up all the ships you want with everything that you could sell to Germany. We'll buy it. Can you lend us some money to buy it? And then we'll pay you back after the war for it. So essentially and that's why you see this huge spike, 1917, with sales to Great Britain. Because they're buying up not only what the US is selling Britain, but also what it would have been selling Germany. So you have this great cartoon capturing the complexity of this issue. Here's John Bull and the British Imperial Lion crying tears because they're so sad because their American friends have sent this mean protest to what they're doing. And they have the international law book on their desk. The caption is "hurting their feelings." We've hurt John Bull's feelings, it's so sad. But out back you see all these American ships unloading their cargo. You know, that's the back deal that's really been made. Germany understood what this back deal was, and they knew the only way they could keep Great Britain and France from being supplied is to sink the American cargo ships. Unlike Britain, Germany did not have a large surface fleet. They could not, get out into the open ocean and meet American ships. But they did have submarines, many more than the British had. Submarines can't stop a ship, but they could sink them. And so Germany announced that all this area around Great Britain was going to be susceptible to sinking any shipping here, including American cargo ships. They announced that they were going to be unrestricted submarine warfare. They put ads in the paper saying things like, hey, listen Americans, you might think you're neutral, but if you go on a passenger ocean liner, you're fair game. We're in a state of war. If you are on a passenger cruise liner that's destination is Britain, you are absolutely fair game and we might sink you. This was an ad put in the New York Times before the departure of the Lusitania on May 1st, 1915. Warning, this is a state of war. It was an ad put in by the Imperial German Embassy. Sure enough, 7 days after its departure, the Lusitania, a huge passenger ship, was sunk south of Ireland. 1,200 passengers died, including 128 Americans. There was enormous outrage, as you can imagine, in the US and in Europe with the sinking of the Lusitania. The Germans protested that they had intelligence that there were weapons aboard, munitions aboard, ammunition aboard. The story that the British released about the Lusitania was that there were 2 German U-boats, submarines, that fired 2 torpedoes into the hull of the Lusitania, sinking it. The Germans said, we only had 1 U-boat there, and we only fired 1 torpedo. But people, survivors, heard a second explosion. The Germans said that was the ammunition down below. That debate has been going back and forth for that ever since, really. In 2008, a team of divers said that they had discovered the Lusitania, and they were going to go down and check it out to see if there were munitions aboard. And the British said right before they left, right before the divers went on the expedition, the British said, you know what, we just found something in our files. You may want to be careful when you reach the ship. There may be munitions aboard. And sure enough, the divers did find munitions aboard. There were munitions aboard the Lusitania. But nobody knew that at the time, and this was a cause célèbre. This was a notorious event in the US in 1915. And there was a great kind of clamor to war, that this finally, the US should go to war with Germany for sinking ships. I love this Louis Raymaker cartoon. This is a German U-boat commander, Jesus Christ himself on the waters. Seems to be neutral, sink them. This pretty much sums up the attitude of the Americans. And Germany didn't want that in 1915. They didn't want the US entering the war. And so Germany very quickly backed off and promised, we will not fire upon any more passenger ships. Only cargo ships that we know have weapons aboard. And then they accidentally fired on a passenger ship. This is the Sussex. They killed 50 people. This was a ferry crossing the channel. And right after this, May 4th, 1916, Germany made the Sussex Pledge, it was called. We will not fire on passenger ships. We will fire on merchant ships carrying munitions only, and we will make every effort to rescue crews. This was backing away from the unrestricted submarine warfare that Germany had been prosecuting since 1915. This kept the US out of the war. As long as Germany promised not to sink American cargo ships, the US would not have entered World War I. And we didn't. We didn't. From May 1916 until February 1917, when Germany said, you know what? We are going to sink your cargo ships again. We're going to sink your passenger ships. We're going to sink everything. Germany's calculus had changed February 1917. They were waiting it out. They were waiting for Russia to collapse. They were waiting for France to collapse. Germany was also close to collapse. The only country that wasn't close to collapse was Great Britain. The Ottoman Empire was close to collapse. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was close to every belligerent power but Britain was close to collapse in 1917. I think it was Clemenceau, Premier George Clemenceau said, we just have to live 15 minutes longer than Germany. That's all we have to do to survive it. Germany did a calculation. France is close to collapse. The French army is finally in mutiny. The poilus, as they were called. Does anybody speak French? The hairy ones, yes. The French nickname for infantry soldiers is poilus, which means hairy ones. You know, we have G.I. Joe and grunts and stuff like that. The poilus were mutinying. April 1917 should mean the dawn. The mutiny became overt. Soldiers in mass refusing to go to the front, refusing to fight any longer in these wasteful battles. The French responded brutally, sending 24,000 to Devil's Island, executing 50 for treason. I mean, it was not pretty. Germany got caught wind of this and recognized that France was on the edge of collapse. By the way, there's a great movie about this whole French mutiny in World War I, starring Kirk Douglas, called Paths of Glory. You might remember it. It's worth watching again. It's a wonderful movie. Kirk Douglas plays a French attorney defending the mutineers on the treason charge. I think it's Stanley Kubrick's first movie. France looks like it's close to collapse. Russia looks like it's close to collapse. The Russian army is still fighting on the Eastern Front, but they're barely being fed. They're barely getting the ammunition and the clothing that they need. The little railroad tracks that there are in the Russian Empire are bypassing the cities. All the wheat, all the food is going to the front line. The cities are starving in Russia. And so, on March 8th, 1917, there's a protest in St. Petersburg. March 8th, International Women's Day, we call it now. This is where it came from. This is why March is Women's History Month, because of this. They were a bunch of communists. No, seriously, the Russian Revolution starts here, on this date, in Petrograd. St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd because St. Petersburg was too Germanic a name. So there's a protest, there's hunger in the cities, women pour out in protests. Turns into hunger riots turn into protest turns into revolution. This is the first day, this photograph, the first action of the Russian Revolution of 1917. This is where it starts. A week later, the Tsar is deposed. Happened that quickly, 1 week. Tsar is placed under arrest, and he's put under house arrest. So, seeing that Russia's collapsing, France is collapsing, Germany decides to unleash their unrestricted submarine warfare. War fever is building up in the United States in early 1917, and then this hits the press. The Zimmermann telegram. Have you ever heard of that? This is a telegram that was intercepted by the British from the German Foreign Minister, Albert Zimmermann, to the German ambassador to Mexico. And in it, Zimmermann says, hey, tell the Mexicans that if they join us and fight the US, we will make sure that they get Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona when it's all over. This was the final straw. There was a groundswell of opinion in the US that the US had to go to war against Germany. So Woodrow Wilson goes to Congress April 6, 1917, and he requests that Congress vote a declaration of war against the German Empire. And in his speech to Congress, I think Woodrow Wilson oversells the war. Easy to say 100 years later. Easy to judge this at the distance of the 21st century. But I think it's clear now that if Wilson had said, this is a war that we didn't want, this is a war that we tried to stay out of, this is an ugly, destructive war, but it's necessary for us to save an indispensable ally, for us to preserve the freedom of the seas, we have to go to war with our eyes open and tip the balance of the stalemate. He didn't say that. Woodrow Wilson did not say that. He said, this is a war to remake the world. The world must be made safe for democracy. We have no self-doctored photographs. It invented newspaper stories. It printed 75 million of these very colorful, eye-catching posters. They were posted all around the country. Look, this is the enemy. How do you not hate that? How do you not hate that? Kind of making this balance of power war in Europe kind of a racial war against a hated enemy. It hired millions of what were called 4-minute men. These 4-minute men were trained to give 4-minute speeches. Silent movies in those days had 2 reels. It took about 4 minutes to change a reel. And they would rush up on stage, give a speech backing the war all around the country. And you see, the enemy being depicted like this, a brute with children hanging on the end of a bayonet, that kind of thing. The anti-German hysteria was just out of control in the US. Germans were excluded from parks, Germans were tarred and feathered. There was a conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra was arrested for playing Beethoven. 16 states had laws against teaching German in school. Libraries around the country burned German books. I mean, it was really out of control. Pretzels disappeared from bars around the country. Nobody drank beer anymore because it was Germanic. Hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches. Frankfurters became hot dogs. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. German toast became French toast. Cities around the country changed their names. Families changed their names if they sounded too Germanic. That's how extreme. Dachshunds were rounded up and euthanized, which makes me sad being a dog lover. At its worst, in April 1918, this man, Robert Prager, who's a miner in Collinsville, Illinois, German, suspected of being a spy, a mob got to him and hanged him, lynched him. And it turns out that he had tried to join the US Navy, had been rejected because he was blind in one eye. The men who lynched him were put on trial, found not guilty after the jury deliberated for 25 minutes. So the real challenge for the US was it's one thing to declare war and to build up war fever, it's another thing to get into the fight. That meant taking an army of 120,000 men and building it to 4 million. And how that was done and who led it will be where I pick off next time. Thank you.